So we will get started with chapter 14. As I mentioned, this is our last chapter of the semester. So in terms of organizational change, this is, I think, a pretty useful chapter. If you've had a chance to do the reading, you probably saw that a lot of it can be applied to your jobs because change is something that's, it's certain. It happens whether we want it to or not. And it's something we all have to deal with. I think it's something that, all of us have been having to deal with over the last few months. And when we're talking about organizational change, we're talking about changes in the workforce as well as cultural differences that force organizations to adapt and change. So change can be small or big. It can be something like a merger acquisition. It can be implementing a new strategy, entering into a new market. So don't get too caught up in this, in this concept of organizational change. It really refers to any change that can take place in an organization. And changes come about for a lot of different reasons. So down here under examples, we have economic, technological, globalization, cultural shifts. So what sort of economic changes do you think are occurring right now? When there's economic uncertainty like we have right now, people tend to not spend as much. Now, with the stimulus money that's coming, that's changed things a bit. People are probably spending that money. But for the most part, when there's economic uncertainty, people are fearful of the future. They're fearful that they may not have a job in the future, and they tend to be saving. So what happens to organizations when people spend less, when they have less disposable income? Well, people buy less, right? So if people have less money to spend, they buy less, demand for your products and services goes down. And what does that mean for your workforce? If demand for your products and services goes down because people have less money to spend, then what occurs is you have less demand, and in return, you need to produce less. So because you're selling less. And so what all this means basically is that as we face economic downturns, organizations have less demand for their products and services, meaning they don't need as many people on their staff because they're not producing or they're not selling as much as they were before. So people become unemployed. That more people who are unemployed means that there are more people available to work, which means competitions for jobs is higher, wages usually remain stagnant. So this is a lot of, one economic, given it's a big economic change, but one economic shift can really have a big impact on an organization. And we know that economic recessions happen about every 10 years on average. So we were really overdue for one anyway. So this is something that CEOs who were more progressive, more proactive, were probably planning for something. Probably not planning for a pandemic, but planning for some sort of recession. So what sort of technological changes have occurred that have maybe changed your life? A lot of organizations are figuring out that a lot of what they had been doing face-to-face could be done online. Given, like was talked about earlier at Fresno State, there are certainly difficulties in not working face-to-face, but organizations that are able to capitalize on this can create a competitive advantage through this economic downturn. For example, Spotify, they just created this huge building in New York City, this new building that they were going to move their employees to, and now they decided that they're never going to send employees there. I'm not sure if they're going to sell the building or what they're going to do, but they essentially said, hey, why are we spending millions of dollars every year on this stuff when our employees are happy working at home and they're effective and they're productive? So I think what you'll find is that a lot of these jobs that have moved online, I think a fair number of them probably aren't going to go back to face-to-face, at least not in the near future. I know for people like me who I have a baby at home, and it's pretty nice being able to be around him all the time and there are certainly difficulties in working from home, but there are definite benefits to it. So this, technological shift, this shift to more online, is also related to a cultural shift. So the cultural shift of telecommuting, of flexible schedules, is something that's been occurring for a long time, and some companies were more prepared for it than others. So in terms of globalization, how does globalization affect an organization? How does that change the way companies do business? So globalization simply refers to the trend of organizations working across a global platform. So companies are now drawing from all over the world for business and for employees. So has anyone heard of the website Fiverr? It's Fivver. So check it out if you have a chance. But this is something, one of my companies, we needed training videos made. And we went on, and there are people who are experts who are all over the world, and they'll create really professional videos for like $15. And it's not just videos, it's basically anything you need, you could get done. There's, as a college student, if you wanted to make sales calls, you could make like $1 per call or something, and make a couple $100 a day doing this stuff. So, and I don't know if it's all legit and stuff, so you probably want to check that out first. But I've used it before, and it's been really useful. So now you have, when we're talking about globalization and organizational change, as a company, you have to compete with other organizations that are drawing on companies that are drawing on a workforce that's really global. And that's really tough to do. I mean, imagine if you're a company and you're only using US labor, and it costs you $100,000 to create an app, when you can go to Bangladesh and get an app made for, there's someone on there she charges $5,000 an app, and she's made a lot of money. And then this also brings up an ethical question too, of is it right to, let's say, pay someone $1 a day when the prevailing wage there is 50 cents a day, even though $1 a day isn't really a livable wage, in just about anywhere in the world. So there's competitive questions there's ethical questions, and all of this is stuff that you're going to be faced with. You're going to have to deal with when you're working in a business environment. So we see that there are these different forces that are acting to push organizations to change, and change can happen in a number of different ways. It can happen, the two main ways are through evolutionary and revolutionary change. So evolutionary change is basically change that occurs slowly over time. So there are a lot of, people have a set way of doing things. They're usually institutional forces like rules and laws that you have to follow that slow the pace of change and the rate of upheaval. And so oftentimes change takes place over a long time. However, if we look at, as we'll look today at the punctuated equilibrium model, there are periods of radical change where, if we go back over the last 25 years and look at different industries, we see that there's always been a point in time where something rapid has happened and a huge change has occurred practically overnight. So can you think of any industries where there's been a huge change, just about overnight? I was just at a restaurant the other day, and was this outdoor restaurant in San Luis Obispo, and they had this menu where it's just a QR code. So you take out your phone and you scan it, and that's kind of changing. I think that was a shift that was pushed pretty recently, but you'll probably see more and more of that, which I think is a good thing. Look at big changes over time. Look at things like cell phones. A lot of you are too young to remember, but when the iPhone came out, I remember I was in grad school and I was like, this thing is stupid. Why would you want a computer on your phone? And now we're all addicted to them, right? So this is something that before that, the whole cell phone industry was entirely different. The way people consumed news and social media was different, but that changed things really overnight. And look at, while we're in entertainment, look at things like Netflix. Netflix, initially they started with DVDs and then they started the streaming service. I mean, this was a change that, arguably there was a period of transition, but this took place pretty rapidly and really changed the way that we consume entertainment. So if companies aren't ready for this, I'm really kind of giving away too much of the punctuated equilibrium model here, but if companies aren't seeking out these forces that are going to drive radical change, they're going to be left behind. We'll get to more examples of that later. So when we're looking at organizational change, we know that these can be small, large scale changes in the workforce, as well as cultural differences that force organizations to adapt and change. So just think about forces that are pushing an organization to adapt or die, basically. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to go over some different models of organizational change and how to manage it. And these, just like when we talked about motivation, there was no perfect motivation theory. Equity theory told us something, when we looked at things like expectancy theory, that told us something different, right? So whereas equity theory was about fairness and inputs versus outputs, expectancy theory taught us about people's willingness to, their motivation to perform an activity based on the expected outcomes that they might have and their expected ability to perform. So this kind of is similar in terms of it. We're trying to paint a picture here of how to manage a change process, and all these models tell us a little bit something different about it. So the first was actually was created in the 1940s, 1947 by Kurt Lewin. And essentially it tells us that there's, this is looking at change really broadly, that when we look at the change process, it involves unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. So this is the simplest model that we'll go over today. And in this process, we have in the first stage, unfreezing. So in order to make a change, and you can apply this stuff to your own life, you can apply it at work, but if you want to initiate successful change, you first need to overcome the existing ways of thinking. In an organization, you probably had people say, we're doing it this way because we've always done it this way, or this is the best way to do it, we should keep doing it this way. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But we need to say, okay, let's look at things differently. What if we're wrong here? What if there is a better way of doing things? One of the best ways to unfreeze a situation, to break that mental model of a way of doing things, is by demonstrating a need for change. So essentially saying to people, if we don't change, this is what's going to happen. And a lot of times when we look at a large scale organizational change, a lot of the change that's made is necessary to survive. So, if you're in the automobile industry right now, if you're not thinking about electric vehicles or self-driving cars, then you're probably going to be in a world of hurt in 5 or 10 years. So you've got to tell people, hey, this is how it's going to impact you if we don't change. People need that to be able to buy into it. And next is the changing process. So this refers to when change intervention is started and ongoing. Here, you want to show people not just what happens. You've already talked to them, hopefully gotten their buy-in a bit on the need for change. But now you want to show, how is this change going to benefit you? So here you're elaborating what your vision is, what the future of the organization is going to look like as you make this change and it's successful. And once you've done this and you've implemented the changes you wanted to make, now you want to refreeze the situation. So refreezing is all about institutionalizing. When I talk about institutionalizing, what I mean is we're trying to embed our new way of doing things into the organization so that we don't go back to the way things were. So how do you institutionalize change? How do you make sure that people don't go back to the way that things were? Think about how do we embed this into our current process? And in order to do that, we want to think about, what are our processes and policies that drive the way that we do things in our organization? What are our cultural values that drive beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors in our company? And how do we institutionalize this change in those ways? So just to give you an example, one of the companies I worked at, we implemented lean manufacturing. And so essentially what we're trying to do is eliminate waste in the manufacturing process. Now, I worked in a corporate office, and we didn't actually manufacture anything there. I was responsible for hiring. But we knew that in order to create a culture of eliminating waste from a process of doing things to perfection, we needed to demonstrate that at the corporate level. So when I went into work that day, I had a place where I put my phone, and it was labeled. I had a place where I put my water, that was labeled. I had a place where I put my pen, and that was labeled. The idea was that it wastes time to take even an extra second to look for where did I put my pen or my phone or my drink. This sounds a little crazy, but it shows people in the entire organization that this is something that matters to us. This is going to become part of our culture. And we institutionalize that not just through those signals and artifacts, but through the policies and procedures that we made. So when we went about doing things, we took a lean approach to doing them and said, okay, what is the process that we're going to get involved in here in order to get this task done, whatever it was, and how do we eliminate waste from that process? So think, and another example would be something like management by objectives. So if you're going through your performance appraisal every year and you're trying to refreeze this new situation, let's say it's the one I just mentioned, then when you're rating people's performance, you want to rate them based on how well they've embraced that culture and those new ways of doing things. That's what their appraisal should be based on. So when you think about Lewin's model, just think about this is one of the most simple ways to look at organizational change. It involves unfreezing, changing, and refreezing. So unfreezing is just breaking down these existing mental models or ways of doing things. Changing, which is showing people how the change will benefit them, and then refreezing is trying to institutionalize this change. So if we have time, we'll come back to this exercise. Punctuated equilibrium. I've talked to you a lot about this already, but Lewin's work that the model that we just discussed is really useful, but it kind of tells us that change is something that slowly occurs over time. And that's where you could fault that model. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of examples in many different industries where we see this radical, not just evolutionary change, but we see radical change occur fairly quickly. And I won't go all over them all again, but we see things like cell phones, like electric cars, self-driving cars. What's another one that's you think will be is going to change things overnight? Well, it doesn't just have to be a technology. When you're thinking about this stuff, think about like the Me Too movement. If you're in HR in an organization and you're not paying attention to that, that's probably going to be problematic for you, because there were things that were maybe not necessarily acceptable, but things that were allowed to go on before this movement that now are getting called out a lot more quickly. And so, this societal change is something that organizations need to be paying attention to, because this is a pretty quick change in organizations about what's acceptable and what's not. And companies that aren't paying attention to it are going to be in trouble. So for your company, you want to be thinking to yourself, not just what's going to impact me in a year, but what's going to impact me. Sorry, there's a plane going overhead. So not just what's going to impact me in a year, but what's going to impact me in 5 years, in 10 years. What new technology, what new societal change, what new governmental regulations are potentially going to jolt my environment, and how can I be ready for that? I think, this pandemic is something that a lot of people weren't ready for, and it's something that was arguably hard to predict. There were, as we look, hindsight's 2020, and there were, as we've seen, signals that something like this was coming about, but it was really, really hard to time exactly when that was going to occur. But the point is, you should have a plan in place when stuff like, when major changes do occur. You should, and one I think really good example of this is, has anybody heard of Chris Hadfield? So he's an astronaut, and he was the director of NASA for a while. But he talks about, we'll just look at, change at a very small level. He talks about getting prepared for different things and how they're always ready for whatever could occur. So they have these simulations they go through when they're flying a spaceship. And on one of his spacewalks, he essentially left some soap inside of his helmet, and it got into his eye and blinded him during a spacewalk. Now, normally this would be a pretty scary thing. You're in space, you're completely blind, you're outside of your spaceship. And at this point, he wasn't really sure why he was blind. Was it temporary? Was it something long-term? But they had simulated what it would be like to get back into the ship and to how they would manage different problems. And so he didn't have to worry. It's not that his heart rate spiked. He just worked through the problem and said, okay, well, what could be the cause of this? How do I manage this? I should call Houston and make sure that they're involved in this process. The point is, because he had thought about every possible outcome that could happen, he was ready when something did go wrong. Okay, so model transitions. The models that we've talked about so far are talking about change happening to people, but they disregard the fact that change is something that doesn't just happen to people, it's something that happens within people as well. So this transition is something that this is essentially, when we have individuals transition through change, they go through an internal process that essentially they have to deal with the change, right? Because we figured at first what the research did was they looked at, okay, how do we tell people what's the most effective strategy to change? But it didn't say what's the most effective strategy to deal with the attitudinal and behavioral aspects of change. So when people resist change, how do we deal with that? And what we find is, when we look at large-scale organizational change, it doesn't fail because of the finances were off or because of some technical reason. More often than not, it fails because of employees and their resistance to it. So what this model did is it took into account these psychological aspects of change. And so what it says is that people go through essentially 3 different phases of change. So they have these intrapsychic analyses involved in change. And these 3, this ending, neutral, and new beginning, these are all part of that. So when we look at this model, we see ending is when you first go into change. Let's say your company is going through layoffs. So I know a lot of people are probably dealing with this right now. And initially, there's usually a lot of resistance and upheaval, especially, right now, people are probably more understanding because of the situation that we're in. But when, if there's layoffs normally, people or really any change you're trying to implement, people generally resist it because they tend to catastrophize. So has anyone here thought that the worst case scenario was going to happen rather than the most likely scenario? Something that we all do. We all catastrophize from time to time. Maybe it's just me, I don't know. But I think, at one point or another, we've all kind of thought the worst case scenario was going to happen, even though it wasn't the most likely scenario. And so this is essentially what tends to happen with employees. When we don't know something, we feel threatened, and we usually think about, well, what's the worst thing that could happen, and believe that to be true. And so, of course, people are going to resist this change. So one of the best things you can do here is just try to listen empathetically to your employees and to communicate openly. Communication about organizational change, we see that when there are large changes like a merger and acquisition, or there are layoffs, there are restructuring, only about 0.5% of communication that employees receive is about that change. So as a general rule of thumb, however much you think you should communicate with your employees during organizational change, increase that by about 10. You can't over communicate to your employees. You want to tell them what's happening, when it's happening, and if you don't know, you want to say you don't know. So one thing that GE did, which was really useful during the Great Recession, is they said, back in 2008, they said, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we know that there's going to be an economic downturn and that you may be affected by this. And so they said, if we do have to lay off employees, first we're going to let go of all of our contractors, and then employees are going to get a 3-month notice. So you knew when you're going to work that, okay, I don't have to worry about paying the rent at the end of the month or the mortgage at the end of the month, because at least I'm going to get a 3-month notice, and then I'll get, unemployment and all that stuff. So that was a good way. People are, as this ending period is really all about resistance, people pushing against this change, kind of denying it, maybe anger. And then this neutral zone, as people start to transition mentally, there's still a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty, anxiety about what's occurring. So at this stage, you really want to be giving people a direction. You should have a vision of what's going to occur in the future. And this is something you should be able to talk to. And your vision is your future state of the organization. So at this point, hopefully, you've demonstrated a need for change. You've talked about what the future looks like, and now you want to continue to communicate, continue to provide direction, give a vision of what the organization is going to look like in the future, and set up quick wins. So quick wins are useful because you're saying, let's say there's a change at work where you are implementing a new way of doing things, like at Fresno State, teaching online. So a lot of students and faculty didn't like it, and for a lot of valid reasons. But it's something that's going to be, for the time being, it's something we have to deal with, at least for faculty. So one of the things that would be useful is to highlight quick wins. So what worked, what didn't work, and to really highlight those success stories so that people can see, okay, there are some positives in this change. And then as we see people buying into the change more, we see more hope, more enthusiasm toward the future, and more acceptance about what's happening here. And so here we generally want to set up a reward system that rewards our employees for engaging successfully in this new change. And generally, the model that we'll talk about in just a minute, John Kotter's 8-stage model of change, he said essentially you need about 75% of the workforce to buy into change in order to for it to be successful. And that's just as a rule of thumb based on the companies he's witnessed. In terms of John Kotter's 8-stage model, he was a Harvard Business School professor, and he looked at over 100 organizations and essentially said, let's look at the exemplars. Let's look at who's been through organizational change that's gone really well, and who's done really poorly. And let's take those lessons learned to try to apply it so that we can go through change more successfully in the future. So a pretty reasonable hypothesis here. And so what he came away with was this 8-stage process, so that change successfully, he's found, generally goes through these 8 steps. And just breaking them down broadly, we see creating a climate for change, we see engaging and enabling the whole organization, and implementing and sustaining change. And so this first stage of the process, we're trying to first create urgency. So you'll find that this model draws from a lot of the models that we've talked about already, that demonstrating a need for change. That's exactly what you're doing here. You're trying to create some urgency for people to want to change. Then creating a coalition. So what's the benefit of finding people to buy into your change, to finding maybe champions of your change? And this, again, when I'm talking about change, maybe let's just use an example of a merger. So you're going to merge with another company, and this can be threatening to a lot of people because it could, they might feel that their job or their benefits are threatened in some way. So what's the benefit of getting a few people to buy into it? So when we're talking about creating a coalition of change, what we want are people to champion our ideas because they can influence others. And so we can do this in a really technical way. We could do a social network analysis, see who's most influential in the organization and try to get them to champion our ideas. We could also try to find who are the resistors that we want on board. If we can change the way that they feel about this, those people who are really vocal and against the change, if we can change their minds, then they're going to be really good examples for other people of, hey, if that person was against us, if they buy into it, then maybe we should too. So creating a coalition just helps as a driving force to get people to be on board with your change. And then developing a vision and strategy. So again, this vision is just the future state of the organization. This is something that you should be able to communicate, in an elevator ride to your employees. What why, not just why you're engaging in that change, but what the future state of the organization is going to look like. So this is the first part of change. If we want change to be successful, we need to create a climate for change. So think about the things that you want to implement in your organization at a very high level. These are the things that you need to be doing. So next, engaging and enabling the whole organization. So this vision that you've developed in the first stage, you're communicating that, you're empowering other people to make action toward the change. So this is removing any barriers that are in the way, any bureaucratic things, any red tape, and then the quick wins that we talked about. You want to set up, change can be scary for a lot of people. So let's say we're merging with another organization, or let's just use that example. So people might say, well, I feel like our culture is not going to fit with their culture, or they have different systems or processes. So whenever we can, we want to say, okay, what are some small wins that we can create between these two? What are some things we know are going to work that we can highlight? You want to get those things knocked out early on and highlight those so that people are more buy in more to the change. Okay, so lastly, implementing and sustaining the change. So you want to leverage wins to drive the change. So those wins, quick wins that you set up, you're really going to promote and advertise them in this stage. And you're going to try to embed these changes in your culture through institutionalizing them in ways that we talked about. So, creating core values related to change through the performance appraisal systems that you use should be based on the changes that you're trying to implement. How well, let's say I want to be a safety-driven culture. That's the change I want to implement. Well, then my core values should not just be about safety, but they should also be embedded in my performance appraisal system. The things that I reward people for, they should be related to that in some way. So this is going to be a pretty quick class today, but the last thing that we have to cover, the last thing from this chapter that you'll probably see in the exam is the McKinsey 7S framework. So McKinsey is a global consulting firm. They're like Boston Consulting Group. They're one of the leading firms. And two of their consultants came up with this 7S framework. And essentially what it tells us is that there are basically 7 different things that need to be coordinated in order for change to be successful. And so you can use this for a lot of different things, but it's generally used to analyze organizational change and what's going well, what needs to be done differently. So you'll see there are hard elements and there's soft elements. So the hard elements are these things up top here, and the soft elements are the things down here. And so all that hard and soft means is that soft elements are easier to influence and change, whereas hard elements are a bit more difficult. And if you want change to be successful, all of these things need to be aligned. So let's say you have a strategy to enter into a different business segment. So you are your Tesla and you want to enter into solar. So what you would do is look at all these things and see how they're aligned. Well, we know what our strategy is, but does this fit with our values? So we have to determine what are our core values as an organization. What are the things that we value that should drive our behaviors and beliefs in the organization? Are those, is that in line with what we're doing? For them, it is. They're trying to create essentially a sustainable energy ecosystem. So that's part of it. And then we want to look at all these other things and say, are these aligned as well? So for example, skills. Do my employees have the right skills to be in this new industry? If not, how do I need to train them, or do I need to find new people? And your values are going to be what guides that as well. If my values are that I consider employees as, something that can be disposed of easily, then I'll just hire new people who have those skills. But if I value my employees as, I feel like they're long-term investments, that they're investing their time in my company and I need to invest in them, then I'll probably train them up to be able to do those jobs. So relating to that is staff. Do we have the right people in the right place at the right time? Do we need more people, less people? And style, this is leadership style. So essentially the way of doing things in our organization, is that going to be aligned with, this new strategy that we have and the new industry that we're entering into. And then systems and structure. These just broadly refer to systems are essentially the systems and policies, processes that we have in place, the way that we get things done. And this can be both our systems in terms of from an infrastructure standpoint, and also it can refer to just, again, the policies and procedures that we have. And then our structure is, the structure of the organization. What is the hierarchy of our company? Do we have a really tall hierarchy, a short hierarchy? Do we have, do we have a lot of, let's let's say you want to get something done in this new industry and you need to get things done quickly, but you have this huge hierarchy where there's a lot of people reporting to other people and all the way down, and you're too slow to respond to fast changes in this industry. Well, now you need to rethink the way that your structure is and potentially change that. So when you're thinking about the 7S framework, the big thing to think about here is that you want to think about all the important components in your organization. You know, the people that you have, the leadership style that you have, the skills that your employees have, the systems, the policies, procedures that you have in place, the way your organization is structured, the strategy of your organization, and are all of those things aligned? And are they all aligned with our values as well? Our values, your shared values are at the center because they are the ones that should inform the way that you do everything else. The decisions about who you hire, how you hire, the skills that you look for, those should all come out of your shared values. Okay, so we've looked at a couple different models today. The main thing to get away from today is that there's no perfect way to implement change. That there are some ways, some things that we need to analyze when we're going to enter into change. And those are, you know, first, what are the steps that we need to take when we're trying to implement change? Kotter's framework provides a pretty reasonable guideline, but it doesn't necessarily address everything. So Kotter's change model simply tells us when change needs to occur, what are the steps we should follow to make that change? If you're going to try to change something in your organization, I recommend going back and looking at Kotter's model. But the other aspects that it doesn't necessarily address are things like we talked about with transitions. So that model of transitions with the psychological aspect of change, this can't be understated. Because remember, change usually fails because people don't buy into it. They resist it for whatever reason. So we need to look at the psychological aspect of change and really give it due consideration. So what you can do here is when you're trying to deal with the psychological component, you first want to see where are your employees at in terms of change. So what I'd recommend is doing some sort of survey of your employees. You can look at their change management history. So what have they gone through in the past that might affect them in the future, might affect the way they perceive this change. You can also look at things like their threat appraisal. So how threatened are they of this new change that you're going through? Could be, again, this change could be anything. It could be merger, acquisition, it could be layoffs, it could be entering into a different industry, a different environment. How threatened do they feel, and what are the things that they feel are threatened? And then you can, once you have this information, you can start to address, okay, I've got these trouble areas where people have had, you know, really bad experiences, or you know, people are really threatened in this group. So how do I deal with that stuff? If there's only one takeaway you have from today, if there's only, you know, one thing you could remember 10 years from now, it would be that the biggest failure I see organizations make when they go through change is not communicating well enough or frequently enough with their employees. So people are left in the dark. They don't know what's happening. And a lot of times it's because leaders simply say, well, we don't know what's going to happen exactly, or I don't want to share with them that something's going to happen to them. But the problem with that thought process is that people oftentimes are going to assume the worst. So if you don't tell people what's happening, they're probably going to assume a worse situation than is reality or than is reasonable. So my thought on this is be as transparent as possible when you're talking about the change. If there's something that you can't communicate or you can't be transparent about, then you want to set up some sort of psychological buffer, like I mentioned with GE in that 3-month mark, that if something does happen to you, you'll have a 3-month notice, you'll have this, you know, we'll give you these resources to find a new job and so forth. So create some sort of psychological buffer for your employees if you can't be transparent about the change. But most of the time you can be more transparent than companies are. The other thing to think about is with punctuated equilibrium, you want to think about change isn't just something that occurs over time. There are a lot of times when change has happened rapidly and companies haven't been ready for it. And that's partially because rapid changes, radical changes, I should say, are a lot harder to see than evolutionary change. But that doesn't mean that you should just say, okay, because it's hard to predict, I shouldn't think about it. You should be, just like Chris Hadfield, you know, the astronaut, you should be thinking about what are all these different scenarios that could occur in the future, and am I ready for those? And how likely are each one of those to occur? and then plan, spend more of your time and resources, of course, on things that are more likely to occur. But you should have a plan in place for a pretty wide variety of situations as a leader of an organization. And then this one, I'll just let you think about after class. If you have something, let's think about something in your own life that you want to change. What's something that you wish were different about your life? The cool thing about a lot of the things that you've learned in this class is that you can apply it to your own life as well. But think about, in part of Lewin's model of organizational change, this three-stage process that we talked about. In order to unfreeze, change, and refreeze, we first need to know, what is a need for change. If we're going to demonstrate a need for change when we're trying to unfreeze things, we need to know what is the problem. So you want to define, let's say in your own life, what's the current problem? What's the current state? And what's your desired state? What do you want your life to look like? Then think about all the forces that are working for and against you in making these positive changes. There are going to be probably some bad habits that you have, or maybe your current situation, it makes it difficult for whatever reason, your family, your monetary, whatever forces that are pushing against you reaching your goals. So write those things down, and write things down that are on your side. Maybe your motivation, your intelligence, your personality. Then rate the strength of each force, indicate how important each one is. Probably you're going to do that based on how strong they are. And then list how to strengthen each supporting force, each force that's helping you to move in the right direction. So, maybe your daily habits now, let's say they are something that's helping you. So how do you make sure that something that you're doing positive, you continue to do? And then think about how to weaken those forces that are pushing against you. Maybe you have people in your life who are telling you that you can't do something, and that's hurting you from reaching your goal. So maybe channeling out those voices somehow, or spending less time with those type of people. And then identify resources needed to support forces for change and reduce forces against change. So it's hard to do things on our own. What do you need to ask for help for? Or what sort of resources do you need to build up? Maybe it's education, maybe it's experience in order to get to where you want to be. And then make an action plan. So use those SMART goals that we talked about early on, those specific goals, measurable, attainable, time-oriented. So when you're thinking about all of these different things, write down your SMART goals, create milestones, and then write any responsibilities that, I missed relevant in SMART goals. They should be relevant to what you want to get. So write those things down, create an action plan for how you're going to do this. And again, if you don't need to do this now, but think about this. I mean, this is going to be super helpful for you. And the reason why this is in here is because, I'm asking you to do it for your own life, but this is something that as an organization, let's say you're sitting down, you're thinking about, okay, well, we need to make changes in the organization. If you want to be successful in this unfreezing stage, you've got to do this force field analysis first in order to figure out what are those drivers that are pushing the need for change and that are pushing against your ability to make that change in order to approach this, this three-stage process successfully. Okay, so that is all we have to cover for today. Thank you so much. I know this has been a tough semester being online, but you guys have been great. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you one day. All right, take care, everybody.